Hey there, little chickens. It's Miss T here. It's always awkward for me to look at myself when I'm lecturing, but sometimes I use my hands and sort of talk on this little screen here. So I'm going to keep it on, but I'm making it smaller. You know what I mean? It's so awkward sometimes. Okie dokies. Let's get started today. We are talking about elements and principles of art. And we're specifically talking about them in relation to ceramics. And I think this is a really important lecture for kiddos because it demystifies art for a lot of kids. Sometimes people feel really intimidated when they start to take my class because they're like, I'm not an artist, I'm not a creative person, or blah, blah, blah. And I will always tell you that's not true. But I would also say that you're just out of practice and you've never maybe had an art class before. And so by talking and learning about your elements and principles of art, you'll be able to learn your ABCs and learn your 1, 2, 3s and be able to talk about art in general and also be able to talk about your own work and also talk about ways of improving and enhancing your work. So we're going to start by learning our ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. These are the elements of art, the elements that make up the pie. So we're talking the sugar, the butter, the cherries, and the crust, and all the yummies and good things that make up the piece as a whole. So they are line, shape, form, space, color, and texture. And I'm keeping this real simple for you guys. Some people will have a much longer list. I like to keep it short and sweet. All right, so we're going to look at some ceramics, some art pieces. Here's a piece by Margreet Zwetsloot. That's tough for me to say some of these names. And when you're looking at an artwork, obviously it's not, more often than not, it's not made 100% up of lines. It can be, it's possible, but a lot of times artworks use multiple elements, multiple principles of design. But today we're just going to kind of identify the sort of obvious ones, right? So we're talking about lines. And so lines are a point in space that is moving. So like a line, boop, lines. And this piece also has other elements of design like texture and shapes and colors and things. But by using this repeating line, you can see it makes it sort of interesting, this landscape. So here we go. We got lines. Moving on. Shapes. Shapes are when you take a line and you draw it and complete it into a shape. A shape is two-dimensional, okay? So a shape on this plate would be like these circles. There's little, it doesn't have to be a geometric shape. It could be an abstract, amorphic shape. It could be these sort of like C shapes. Here they cut out some shapes and they are little triangles involved. There's a circle right here, a little orange triangle, and things like that. So here's some examples of elements within the piece that are shapes. And this is Stanton Hunter's plate. Forms. Everybody giggles when they see this piece because they're like, ooh, what is that? But this is clay too. And it's a piece by Anne-Marie Laureys. And form is probably the most common element you'll see in clay because we work three-dimensionally. And three-dimensional forms are basically shapes like triangles, squares, blobs that are now gone from two-dimensional to three-dimensional forms. So this is an examples of some blobular forms. And what's cool about this piece I like to talk about is you see all around the piece are these lines. This tells me that the piece was created on the potter's wheel where the artist throws and compresses a big a big cylinder And as you throw on the wheel, your fingers create these lines. And then she probably took her big pot and like laid it, or fell on the floor, or laid it on the floor, and it made these sort of weird folds and rolls and things like that. So form is definitely a major element in this piece. So form are three-dimensional shapes. Awesome. So we're kind of building on that. Here are some big pots that are shapes. They're three-dimensional forms, right? But in this piece, we're talking about space. This is a big installation by Peter Biddulph. It's hard to say the names. But imagine these pots. They're almost as tall as me. They're like 4 to 5 feet tall, and they are large. And so when we're talking about the amount of physical space that a piece takes up, you could also refer to it as scale. So how big is the work? Is it giant like the David, or is it teeny tiny little itty bitty pieces? Where's the camera? Like this little cat piece the student made. So the amount of space it takes up. So that's another element, space. And color. Everybody knows about colors and loves them, me especially. And here is a piece by Lisa Orr. She does lots of pottery that are all kinds of cool, like rainbow drippy colors. And so she layers and layers glazes on her cups so that they have this kind of rainbow iridescent colorful effect. So color is kind of an easy one for people to understand. You get it. And texture. This is a piece by Wesley T. Wright. I love this guy. He does all these kind of surrealist, hyper-realistic pieces. This is a pretty good sized gorilla. I think I saw it in person. It was almost like I said, almost like human scale. And he's holding a little banana with another small little gorilla. And he's looking at that little gorilla. And in this tiny gorilla's hand is another banana with a gorilla in it. And it's like, whoa. Anyway, so I'm talking about texture on this piece because he has this great texture he's created for the fur and does a really nice job of sort of like piecing out the individual tufts of hair and then adding texture on top of those, which I'm always obsessed with. Like, how can we get more texture and play with texture in your process, in your pieces? So texture is one of the elements we're talking about here. We could also talk about color. We could talk about lines. We could talk about space, all those things, like I said, but I'm trying to specifically talk about one element at a time. Okay, so the elements of art, those are the easy peasy ones. That's like your A, B, C's and your 1, 2, 3s. All right, now we're going to start putting those together in these sort of strategies or formats. So we're going to be creating words, or you're going to start learning about division and multiplication. And so you're taking like your individual elements, combining them and strategizing them to make art. Okay, it's basically Art 101 in a really quick video. All right, so we describe them as principles of design. And so you're taking your elements and you are designing them using these principles. Alrighty, so here we go. Time to level up. We're going to talk about balance, emphasis, movement, pattern, repetition, proportion, rhythm, variety. Well, I know, it's a lot. And unity. All right, so here we go. I'm going to explain them to you. All right, first of all, we're going to talk about balance. This is probably one of the easiest concepts for kiddos. And you can think of it as like visual weight and think of it like a teeter-totter. Is it perfectly balanced, or does it have this asymmetrical balance? Some elements we can see right away on this piece by Thomas Orr is color. We can see shapes, circles. We can see forms, this sort of housey, triangle-y shape. Texture, the glaze has some texture. And what else do I see? and I guess I would even say value, lightness or darkness, which we didn't even talk about, but whatever, you get it. It's part of color. This piece has a symmetrical balance. The darkness of this side is balanced by these 3 dots. It's something like you just know when you see it. It feels right. Anyways, balance. Emphasis. Sometimes these pieces have lots of different principles and lots of different elements as well, but I try to choose pieces that you can identify a very specific principle of design. So you could argue this piece also has balance, it has asymmetrical balance to it in the way it's divided up. But for this one, we're going to talk about emphasis. Emphasis is what attracts your eye, like draws your eye and grabs it into one specific area. And for me, I like to talk about this red square in the center of the piece, it being central, it being darker. It's one of those things where, like, when you kind of squint your eyes and look through your eyelashes, what grabs your attention the most? So that's emphasis. All right, movement. Movement is something that could either be real, like some people actually have their sculptures moving, they put them on motors and their pieces actually move. And some pieces of art have visual movement, and so it sort of has that implied movement. And so that's what's beautiful about working on the potter's wheel, is when you're physically making the piece, it is moving, and so you can show that movement by like dragging your tool through it. So that's what Richard Burkett's done here. As the pot has turned on the wheel, he sort of stuck his wood knife tool in it and dragged it along, and gives it this sense of like it's all, like, even though it's static, it looks like it's moving. Even adding these little feet on the bottom, looks like you could crawl across the table. So that's movement. Pattern. Pattern's an easy one to point out, and for pattern, it's sort of this repeating shapes or repeating patterns. So think like plaid is a pattern. Things like on your shirt, like this is a pattern. And here we go. We got these repeating patterns on the cup. And so this is something that like covers an entire thing. It has elements of repetition to it, but you go, okay, I see a pattern here. Got it? Pattern. This is Pots by Courtney Murphy. Her stuff's super cute. Okay, so what makes pattern different from repetition? They're pretty similar. Like, we're starting to kind of start splitting hairs here. But when I think of repetition as a principle of design, I think of something that's just like repeating, where you start to see lots of the same element. So this same bowl by Careen Stoll is repeating and stackable. So these like stackable bowls, this repetition. It's a little simpler than pattern, if you can tell the difference. Proportion. Ooh, proportion is kind of like balance, but it's a little different. Proportion is a concept. Here's a piece by Gary Erickson, where you're talking about the proportion of like one piece to another. So like he does these really cool seed pod inspired sculptures. And so we're just talking about like the proportion of maybe this part of the pod compared to this little part of it as well. So think of it as like the proportion of like the head to the body of something. So that's proportion. You have like one little itty bitty piece next to something really big. We're playing with proportion. All right, rhythm. This might be the most complicated, hardest concept for a lot of people to understand, and I'll try to explain it as easy as I can. Rhythm is different from pattern and different from repetition in that it has repeating elements, but they start to sort of shift and change, kind of like music, okay? So a pattern will just repeat itself and be the same over and over and over and over and over and over again. Rhythm has some element to it that is changing and shifting and flowing, and that almost has a little movement to it, but it's more like music. So Imagine if this little lidded jar was like, had different tones, and it was like, ding, 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 as it like twists. So this is like a repeating form that the artist made, and then like sort of like shifted it as they built it so that it has that rhythm to it. So the best way to describe rhythm is it's like visual music. So if you were to see music, that's rhythm. That's rhythm. Oh boy, fun one. Variety. Wendy Walgate, who I love. Variety is like showing lots of different stuff all mixed together. And it can be all kinds of random crazy things that have no relation, or it can also be lots of similar things, but with different elements or colors or textures, you know what I mean? So we have similar things, all these little tchotchke, knicky-knacky, ceramic-y things, but she uses a variety of colors to kind of tie them in, even though they're all kitsch and cutesy pootsy kind of things. That's what makes them sort of a collection, but she shows variety by using a variety of colors and textures. Fun. All right. And the last one, which sort of encompasses all that we've talked together, is unity. And unity is sort of like the ultimate goal of artists is using these different elements and using these different principles of design in their work to create a cohesive, unifying good feelings, right? And so unity is when all of those things are just like working together, and it's not often. It's really a special kind of thing that you see, and so on. So unity here in this piece by Nancy Selvin, we have balance. Like all four of these bottles are equally like balanced and symmetrical, like on the shelf here. But we also have a little bit of variety in that they're all a little bit different. There's repetition happening here where it's like repeating bottles. I don't know, you could almost argue this has rhythm to it. Like if these were different song notes, they're kind of in the same thing. Family. There's some great elements of art here. We've got color, like this dark red clay mixed with this light white slips that sort of have like a rusty kind of effect to it that she's added. We've got, I see some lines on the shelf that she's added and on the bottles. I see not a whole lot of texture, but you could argue that the way she painted these colors on sort of gives it a little texture, but for the most part, these seem very smooth to me. And form, they're three-dimensional forms, and I'm not seeing a lot of shapes. Maybe you could argue that this white blotch up here makes a shape, but these make little shapes, but they're really forms. I'm sure you can see lots of other elements and principles in this piece, and that's why I kind of thought of it as like it has unity. You can see something of everything in it. Okie dokie pokies. That is your, where am I? Here I am. Make me big. Make me big. Okay, chickens, that's your elements and principles lecture. And I hope that when you look at your work, you start to recognize some of those elements and principles. Or when you're out in the world and you see artwork, you start to recognize some elements and principles. Get used to them. We're going to be talking about them a lot. Take care, my chickens. Over now.